If you've watched this channel for a while, you know that I'm the kind of guy who likes to watch cartoons that have something to examine in them, and the same is true for Vox Machina. Cartoons, I think, are inherently more open to this kind of examination because each layer of the production has people drawing exactly what they are trying to share. However, with Vox Machina, you get this additional layer of its production as a bit of an independent show that spun off from popular voice actors playing Dungeons & Dragons in live streams. The original Dungeons & Dragons campaigns in the streams weren't a new setup for the voice actors either, as they were already playing these intense games that were privately hosted at their homes. Now, I haven't seen the live streams myself, don't get me wrong, I'm curious about them, but each episode is 6 hours long about, and they have over 100 episodes per campaign, so I haven't dived into them. But even without having watched them, you can already see how these individual actors from the show help make the campaigns what they are with the characters they bring to the table that are all modeled to some degree off of their own personalities, or the personalities that they like pretending as. For those who have not played Dungeons & Dragons, the real fun of it is that you make your own character that is just a fantasy version of you. While 6 hours for 100 episodes is a lot to binge watch, these are the kind of campaigns that Dungeons & Dragons fans love the most. It can be really hard to get a group of people together to consistently play Dungeons & Dragons unless they're legit absolute fans, as if you aren't meeting at least twice a month, it's impossible to really make long campaigns work, and twice a month can still be rather low for the hardcore D&D fans. I grew up moving around a lot, so even with people who really did love Dungeons & Dragons, it was hard to keep long campaigns going, as even if I wasn't about to move, I lived on military bases, so my friends were always about to move too. But even being able to just do one very long campaign in a day with some friends is one of the greatest joys you can have after childhood. D&D has some formal rules, of course, but it's built largely around being able to construct your own stories to play with friends. The dungeon master who writes the story isn't trying to beat the other players, but rather he's actually trying to get them to win. While characters can die and meet their end, the ultimate goal of the game as a whole is to actually just enjoy the experience and make it to the end of the story. You have someone there who is giving you a story and giving you the illusion of danger with these battles that require dice rolls, but he has the power to improvise anything he wants, and killing the characters just leads to the end of the game. Therefore, he tries to give you the illusion that you are in danger with all of these battles that you can get into, but no matter what actually happens, he's only giving you just enough for your characters to handle before you can get healed again. At the end of the day, the point is actually just to play pretend like you would as a kid, with action figures and cool locations on maps to boot, with certain game mechanics introduced to give a sense of worry in the battles, instead of just immediately imagining a victory like you would as a kid with toys. You've essentially created a play where everyone is an actor improvising within a certain premise, and introduced some mechanics in order to give a sense of danger, but there really isn't. The trick to a good game, then, is what you see in the show, a cast of diverse characters of different classes and species that, together, give you full advantage of the scope of the game's powers and skills. Now, sometimes a dungeon master can build a campaign and let the players insert any characters they want into it, but the true brilliance of the game's concept comes when a dungeon master purposely takes each character's story and weaves them together. The dungeon master may have an overarching story he already wants to tell, but oftentimes, at least for me, you can take what the most ambitious players have desired for their own characters and make that the key framework of the story. Then from there, you take the other players' characters with the smaller stories they like for arcs, and then weave them around the main narrative, and even find ways to tie them in together. I remember making a friend one time who had a whole Dungeons & Dragons group going, and I was invited to co-dungeon master with him, and we spent so much time just writing out this giant 12-part story, with each campaign taking about 4 to 6 hours depending on how the people go about it, each time slowly addressing each player's different desires. Unfortunately, even as an adult, it was hard to get that crew to stick together for more than a few campaigns, and while they loved seeing their bare-bones outlines for their characters become these elaborate stories where they got to kind of guide us into guiding them on this adventure, it never made it to the end of the story. A lot of other people have this same experience, unfortunately, as while there are plenty of groups that do stick together and make it through many of the campaigns and stories, a lot of people just get into it for a short while before it suddenly stops feeling like an important part of their lives. For a group meeting basically once a week, that's a pretty big commitment. You're basically giving up one of your weekend days for this, and that becomes hard with real-life events and gatherings and such. And the Critical Role campaigns that led to the Vox Machina animated series are kind of the answer to that. Critical Role was the equivalent of a podcast, which lets someone feel like they're having a conversation about topics they like with people who are interested in them as well. Or video game streamers who give viewers the feeling that they're playing video games with their best buds again like they did as a kid, or that they're at a giant gamer party where everyone's just having a good time. Critical Role was the board game version of that, a place where people who loved Dungeons & Dragons, and especially people who couldn't get consistent groups together to play it themselves, could get a sort of second-hand joy of seeing these voice actors play out their own stories. And people are attracted to Dungeons & Dragons for different reasons, so developing the characters is always a lot of fun. Every group needs a Grog-type character, which is usually played by someone who is there just for the laughs and the booze. These people can honestly borderline ruin the serious moments of the game, but when it's not time for drama, they're the life of the party. Their job in the group is to basically just say stupid shit that makes everyone laugh about how not seriously they take the game, while everyone else pretends to be a more serious character. Don't get me wrong, all of the characters can be funny, and their interactions in the show appear to be rooted in the dynamics of the actual cast in the games. Scanlan's character bridges the gap between people like Grog and people who take the game more seriously. Like with Grog, he's mostly there to tell jokes, but he also gets wrapped up in some of the drama, but both allow for an opportunity for the other characters to act more serious in relation to the more funny characters' irreverence. Basically, the people like Grog get to say something stupid, and the others, while in character, get to insult them as part of the game, but at the end of the day, both are just having fun and creating fun ways for their characters to interact as their personas. What's really fun about Vox Machina is the way the more serious characters' backstories all get to play out in an ensemble cast. The story of Kaelith in particular this season was absolutely insane, for example, with her being rejected by the group and almost being sucked into the earth, only to emerge with her crazy new form to help the others fight. She has such a specific epic backstory that is essentially unrelated to the other characters, with Kaelith being a member of the Air Ashari and having a duty to connect with the other Ashari tribes, but managing to get wrapped up in the adventures of the traveling Vox Machina crew while completing the trials that will make her one day lead her tribe. The same can be said for Pike, who has a very deep story regarding a crisis of faith in her deity back in Season 1. These are stories motivated generally more so by the players than by the Dungeon Master himself, who is able to take the ideas that someone wants for their characters and turn them into more epic arcs. Kaelith and Pike, however, are still a lot more fun, if you will, than Percy. Sure, he can be happy too and crack a lot of jokes, but he's one of the characters with a dark and gritty backstory of betrayal and tyranny. It isn't that the show and D&D as a whole allows you to explore these different characters either, but Vox Machina in particular becomes genius by having them all layered on top of each other in a way that makes them feel more complete, because ultimately, that is what a good D&D campaign is like. Sure, technically everyone's playing the same game, but each person is exploring a different idea of who they are inside and what they want to be or what they find interesting, and the others get to also see that secondhand and see how that jibes or gels with the versions of themselves in their head. This became clearest to me in the finale, where we get an epic conclusion to Kaelith's battle with the dragons, but that's just part 1. It already felt like the end of the episode and like everything was perfect, but the second half still gets into the revival of Percy, and all of this after an entire season of balancing out the relationships of the characters. Instead of having each one be an independent character with their independent stories and thus independent love interests, Season 3 in particular focused on which of the characters would make good or interesting pairings in the show. I'm not one for shipping myself, but when it comes to the unique adaptation of a Dungeons & Dragons type story, it just adds more layers to the meta nature of these characters. Even the finale itself delivers on the promise of Dungeons & Dragons, with the epic battle against the dragons with Kaelith. It doesn't feel generic doing this, as the story had been so many places already in the last 3 seasons, but rather it felt like the climactic end to a particular story to remind you of what this is really all about. While Vox Machina is not legally a Dungeons & Dragons product, it's only because Dungeons & Dragons is designed to allow people to explore unique and original characters and stories in a world that is just sort of open world fantasy. But at the end of the day, it's still what most of us would call a Dungeons & Dragons animated series, because that's why we want to watch it. But what do you guys think? Do you play Dungeons & Dragons? Did you get into Critical Role before the animated series? Tell me about your campaigns you've played and such in the comments down below, and I'll see you guys next time.